Thank you all for coming. And I did hear from several of you that you started Uncle Tom's Cabin or that you have finished reading it. So you've read it more recently than I have, which is kind of fun. I want to tell you about some upcoming programs that the Historical Society and the Babcock-Smith House are presenting. Scott Malloy from the Labor Relations Department at URI is going to be here Sunday, April 7th. And his talk is Hidden Rhode Island History. So that should be fun. Then on April 28th, Sunday, Long Time Gone, the author of that book is going to be here. It's the story, the fictionalized story, of two real brothers who fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. They were both from Rhode Island. And that should be very interesting. You can pick up the handout, which is straight from the Babcock-Smith House website, on your way out if you want to have it with you and put it on your refrigerator. And then the Westerly Historical Society is celebrating its 100th birthday with a special fundraising dinner at the Armory on Rhode Island Renunciation Day, which is May 4th. So, and then we're having our open house at the end of May with a program to be announced. So feel free to pick these up.
And if people did not get an email announcing this event and would like to get an email, please leave your email and your name, and I'll make sure that you stay informed with what we're up to.
It's a new experiment for us.
We're trying.
I'm Ellen Madison. I'm a Board of Trustee member here at the Babcock-Smith House Museum, and it's really nice to have all of you here this afternoon. The focus of our programs has been the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and this certainly fits in, although we kind of missed the 150th anniversary, but it's close enough. I'd like to give my thanks to Linda Chafee, who is filming this so that you can take it home with you sometime or take it to shut-ins who didn't see it. And also, about 35 years ago, read every single word of Uncle Tom's Cabin out loud with me for my dissertation. So it's hard to escape those things. So, show of hands, how many of you have actually either read part of or all of Uncle Tom's Cabin? All right. And how many of you who have not read Uncle Tom's Cabins know the names Topsy and Uncle Tom and Simon Le Great and Little Eva? Show of hands. So that's all the rest of you. Very good. Very good. And that indicates how much Uncle Tom's Cabin has permeated the culture of America. So who is this Harriet Beecher Stowe? Well, here she is in 1880. She is presumably the woman who went to the she is the woman who went to the White House to see President Lincoln in 1862, and he presumably, now I've got my adverb in the right place, said to her, so this is the little lady who wrote the book that started this big war. Well, that story didn't surface until about 30 years after she had visited the White House. But it does give you an indication of the importance of this book. Stowe came from a family of Beechers. She's right here in the lower right-hand corner. She was the 7th of 13 children, born into what is unquestionably the most influential family in the 19th century in America. They were clergymen, artists, writers, social activists, civil rights people. They were authors. It was unbelievable the dominance that they held. Her sister Catherine established a school in Hartford. They lived in Connecticut, which was, of course, associated with education anyway. In 1832, her father accepted a job at Lane Theological Seminary, which was in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was 21 years old, and this was a perfect time for her to make this move. She, Cincinnati at that time was a southern city in a northern state. So she really began to find out about slavery. She visited Kentucky right over the line, where she saw one of the plantations where it was a kind master, and this gave her the influence for the Shelby family plantation, which opens the novel. She also began writing some little sketches, little vignettes and character sketches, and publishing them. And if those of you that have recently read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you notice that there's a lot of characters that stand out, like Eliza and Topsy and so forth, and those little vignettes that populate the book. It was also there that she met Kelvin Stowe, who was a theology professor, who was very eager to get back to New England. And in 1850, he accepted an appointment at, oh, I better get them married first. They got married. Stowe would never have done it. She would have done the other thing. They were married in 1836, and by 1849, they had 6 of their 7 children. So she was not a lady of leisure by any means, and especially when she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was a rather self-absorbed person, thought he was the center of the universe, and when Bowdoin, his alma mater, offered him a professorship, he jumped at the chance. Of course, he sent Harriet and the children ahead first to find a house, furnish the house, get settled, and then he whizzed in, but that's okay. So here she is about the time that she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what had preceded this was in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had been passed. Boston was evidently a hotbed of slave snatchers, and the newspapers were filled with stories of slave snatchers going down through Boston and capturing blacks to take them back to the South. Harriet was no stranger to abolition, and this really, truly bothered her. So where did Uncle Tom's Cabin come from? Well, partly this reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act, partly to her background in Ohio, but mostly to the vision. Harriet was subject to visions, and they most frequently occurred in church because she would zone out. So one communion Sunday, she zoned out. I'm sure she's not the first one to have done that, but she zoned out, and she had this vision of 2 black slaves whipping an old man, also a black slave, to the point of death. And he stood steadfast in his Christian courage, refused to tell the whippers what they wanted to hear, and died, but not before forgiving those who had whipped him. Get the connection here, you know, symbolism. She wasn't far from church. She went home and she wrote it down. And then she shared it with her family, who all said, "Oh, you must do something with this. You must publish it." And she said, "I will." I mean, the stories are really rather dramatic surrounding this. So her brother, who was a real, well, he lent a lot of fuel to the fire. He came to visit her and said, you know, "I'll work with you, I'll do this, I'll do that." And together they said, you know, "We will get this, we'll publish this." So she sent off this description and another one to Dr. Bailey, who was the editor of the National Era, which was an abolitionist newspaper in Washington, D.C. And he knew the family. Everybody in America knew the family. So he said, "Okay, I'll publish it." She had written, "I plan to send 3 or 4 installments." And he offered her $300 for those 3 or 4 installments, which I think pretty good, right? Pretty good pay. But he was the winner because it turned out to be 40 installments. 40 installments of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he never upped that price that he paid her. And it made the National Era certainly a bestseller. And so on we go. Well, she was sending these in manuscript form. He had advertised that it was going to start on March 30th, but she was delayed. And she says that she was delayed because she kept getting more pictures in her head, more visions. So instead of March 30th, it went to press on June 5th. So there was quite a little bit of a delay there. He kept advertising, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and you can read these advertisements in the National Era. This is not the first one, but she had the upper left-hand corner front page, not bad placement. And he had been advertising it as Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Man That Was a Thing, as the subtitle. So somewhere in transition, this stopped a little bit, and she changed it to Life Among the Lowly, which, when you think about it, gives her more flexibility in her storytelling. And one of the interesting side notes to that is that this book became terribly popular in Europe, and that Life Among the Lowly gave it that universality of plight. So you didn't have to be a slave, you just had to be kind of downtrodden to get the picture and identify with the people. Well, here she is, busy writing, busy writing. It's obvious that this is going to be popular. Her kids are all over the place. So Sister Catherine, who had established a school in Hartford, rides in to rescue, and she organizes the family. She says, okay, Calvin, you write, Harriet, you write, I'll take care of everything else. And she pictured herself a businesswoman, which indeed she probably was. And she said, we're going to publish this in hardcover. So she contacted a publisher who turned them down because he had many, many Southern clients, and he was afraid he would lose clients if he published this what was obviously going to be an anti-slavery novel. So the next part is rather unclear. John Jewett, who's a publisher in Boston, and the Stows established some kind of contract. Now the story, you know, who contacted whom and who offered them what, who knows. The story I like is that Mrs. Jewett had been reading the installments in the National Era, and she said to her husband, you must publish this. And he said, yes, dear. And that was the story that he told. So. He wanted the Stows to put up 50% of the cost. And as any teacher's family will know, they didn't have that kind of money. So he offered Harriet a 10% of the royalty, which she gladly took. Too bad. One of the things that does not exist is an international copyright. So, of course, once this went viral, as we would say today, she didn't get a penny from that. She didn't get a penny from any of the spin-offs of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But she was happy. She had the contract. So, there are great stories associated with this, but finally, I have to go back here to my notes because I forgot a whole section. There we go. Okay, so Jewett says, I will publish the book. National Era starts advertising that Jewett is stereotyping the book. Now, stereotyping is very significant here because it means that he knows it's going to be good. Because movable type could only set X number of books. But stereotyping is where you set your type, you make a plaster cast from the type, then you make a metal cast from your type, and you can print so many more books. So he knew. And at this point, he is setting from the National Era text. Okay? What else could he use? She'd sent the manuscript pages to them. He buys the newspaper. He gets his typesetters going on that. But the book has not even run halfway through the whole run in the newspaper. She hasn't finished writing the book by the time he's beginning to set it. This is not a good business deal in terms of trying to figure out how many pages you're going to need or anything else. But that's how it begins. Well, the part that she's still able to write, she continues. And there are wonderful stories about that summer. Her father came to visit. Her father, Reverend Lyman, HR. He sits at the kitchen table with his secretary writing his sermons. And the neighbors report that she, authoress of best-selling installments, is sitting out on the back porch, on the steps, with her writing portfolio, writing out the next chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Do we read his sermons today? No. But that tells you also a little bit about women's places in the world as well. But she can't keep that up because when Jewett catches up with the newspaper, she's got to send 2 copies, one to Boston, one to Washington. Fortunately, she has twin daughters who are now able to take dictation. So Harriet's there working in the kitchen. I don't know where Catherine is at this point, but you know, she's working in the kitchen. She's dictating the chapter, and the twins are writing it down. And sometimes she gets a chance to look at a copy and maybe make a couple of revisions before it goes to Washington or before it goes to Boston. So you get sometimes a difference between the 2 texts, even though she wrote them at the same time. But did you hear me say she had a lot of time to revise? No, this was just amazing that she was able to do that. So, on March 20th, 1852, out comes the first edition. From my notes. 2 volumes, and because he didn't know how many pages there were going to be, they don't have exactly the same number of pages. But there were 634 pages in all. I know that those of you that are reading were able to tell me exactly what page you were on. I'm on page 120 out of 400 pages. So imagine 634 pages in the first edition. $1.50 for plain cloth, $1 for paper, and $2 for cloth full gilt, which is what this one is. And would anybody like to venture a guess as to how many copies were sold in the first 2 days? Nobody's brave enough to say this, but 5,000 copies in 2 days. Okay? Just incredible. Jewett kept 3 presses running 24 hours a day except for Sunday. He had 100 bookbinders working. Today you couldn't even find 3 bookbinders, but 100 bookbinders working. 3 paper mills were producing paper just for Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, those are stunning statistics. By April 10th, 2 weeks later, 20,000 copies had been sold. 2 weeks, 20,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this advertising poster is not exaggerating when it talks about the number of books sold. By the first anniversary, Jewett alone reports that he has sold over 300,000 copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin. A Boston newspaper estimates that around the world, 2,500,000 copies have been sold around the world. This is by the first anniversary. I love this little thing. In Boston, 300 babies had been named Eva. Isn't that great? 300 babies named Eva by the first anniversary. Within the first 6 months, it had been translated into 60 different languages. Dutch, German, Danish. You'll notice that some of these scenes, those of you that have just read the book, have nothing whatsoever to do with the book. There is no scene like this in the book, but we don't care. So, Swedish, 1897, Uncle Tom's death. Italian, notice how classic that is, 1926. German, Danish, I don't know, these are the pictures that make the internet, so they're successful. Italian, 1937, here's one of the few that has the slave auction on it. Swedish, 1902. And Russian, 1915. Each of the illustrations and the book covers reflects sometimes a difference in the way that people were seeing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And here's, not only was there a proliferation of books, this spawned a whole industry called tomitudes, okay? A tomitude is anything that has a picture of a character on it from a book that is not a book. So there were Uncle Tom socks, Uncle Tom snuff boxes, Uncle Tom jigsaw puzzles, Uncle Tom mugs, Uncle Tom's this, Uncle Tom's that. And then we begin the proliferation of other genres. So, with a Providence connection, George Howard asks his cousin, George Aiken, to adapt the book to a stage performance. This guy is fast. The book came out in March. By September, he has this performance going. Most of the characters, the actors, were friends and family. Why not? His daughter played Eva. But it is an incredible, just an incredible thing in terms of what it meant. First of all, it's the first theatrical performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It introduced the single feature entertainment so that it wasn't a whole set of variety acts as had been popular up to then. It was a sustained performance. It introduced the matinee so that women and children could go and enjoy it. It made live theater respectable because, of course, there was this anti-slavery lesson in it. It contained sensational scenes. It had comedy. It had heartbreak, melodrama. But above all, it had this anti-slavery message to it. It was extremely popular. I like that picture of Topsy. It's kind of makes her look like a woman instead of a kid, but kind of nice. This is a later 1903 announcement of a performance.
Excuse me, was that actress blackface?
You know, I don't. No, because it was family and friends in this particular performance. So yes, I mean, she was not black, she would have been in blackface.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. But this, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about the illustration, whether that's, I don't know. I can't tell by that one whether that one is or not. Now this one gets a little bit more extravagant. So you can see that there are 25 colored people from the Cotton Belt. That's exciting. 25 we call them buck and wing dancers, 2 quartets, a pack of bloodhounds. And they actually brought dogs on stage, frequently substituting great big dogs, Great Danes, for the bloodhounds that would have been used to track the slaves. And I forgot to give you guys the overall plot, didn't I? But you know it. I'm sorry, just thought of that. Eliza goes north to freedom, Tom goes south. That's all you need to know. So, and some of these had nothing to do with the plot anyway. But you notice that it has introduced black actors, and that is something that had happened by 1903. So that even though you might have had blackface, you do have black actors who eventually come in. The cakewalk, which we associate with black song and dance people, gave them really and truly a chance to not only mimic white folk, but to actually mock them. So there was this kind of hidden agenda there. The buck and wing dance required enormous dexterity. That gave rise to so many of our black tap dancers that were so skilled and so wonderful at dancing. By the 1890s, 500 companies were traveling. Now when you think about that, 500 companies. Suppose Les Mis was playing in 500 different cities in America. You'd have to just barely step out your door to see a performance. I mean, that's pretty amazing that 500 of them were there. The circus had an impact. Barnum and Bailey had merged, and they had two of everything, you know, like two lions and two trapeze acts and two ringmasters. So we have performances with two Topsies, two Uncle Toms, two Elizas crossing the ice floe. I mean, it just gets berserk. It just gets crazy. We have the minstrel. I'm sorry about this, is a little blurry. I couldn't find one that wasn't as blurry, but the song and dance routine here that became such a part of the shows. In 1912, Charles Stowe estimated that Tom had been put on 250,000 times, and later the Boston newspapers indicated that this was an underestimation of how many times Uncle Tom had been performed. But you can see what a wide variety of performances it's taking. And more people saw the play than read the book. So, and that's not surprising. But just imagine how many people this impacted. And surely this happy plantation life, it's not quite what we read about in Uncle Tom's Cabin book. Fisk University in Tennessee wanted to build a new building called Jubilee Hall. They had a group of singers, mostly black singers, who went on tour, and somebody in the group must have said, let's use Uncle Tom's Cabin as our theme. They were singers, they were not actors, but so they went out on tour under this Uncle Tom's Cabin thing. And they sang spirituals. So that was the first time that many white people in the North had ever heard spirituals. And they loved them. And of course, gave rise to jazz, the blues, swing, rock and roll, hip hop, rap, you know, and these Fisk Jubilee singers really started that in terms of a public awareness of minstrelsy. Not bad. Vaudeville. Oh boy. Did you love it? Now, I can tell you that that's blackface. The Duncan sisters traveled, and they were truly sisters, one playing Eva, one playing Topsy. They had to be phenomenal because they toured 23 cities, and in 3 years they raised $900,000. $900,000 with Eva and Topsy and the rest of the crew. And they didn't stop. the sisters had roles in movies and plays after 1924. They played Eva and Topsy up until 1950. Some of you are old enough to have seen them. I think that changed what we think of as Eva and Topsy quite a bit, but it was amazing. But you know what this did? If you look at this picture, the first thing that you see, obviously, is the grotesqueness of the blackface. But you also see two people who have an affection for each other. You see an interracial bonding. You know, and I think subtly and psychologically that had to have some sort of an impact on our understanding of civil rights and everything else. It's just amazing how entertainment and theater can sometimes shape public policy or can shape attitudes, and I think this is a good example of it. So in 1933, we have Walt Disney's Mickey's Melodrama, and that's not my New England accent, that's exactly how he spelled it, Melodrama. And Minnie is playing little Eva, and Mickey is in blackface. Think about it, a mouse in blackface. It makes no sense. But he's in blackface. Henry Gates, who was the lawyer, the professor rather, who was arrested a couple of years ago, getting into his house in Boston, outside Boston, remember? He has just published an annotated version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And when he was on tour or writing about it, he said, how did the censors let this get through? Because this is, they are an item. They're together. They're holding hands. It's a black person and a white person holding hands. And maybe it was more acceptable in cartoon form. You know, maybe that's the way it had to be introduced. But it certainly was there. And then all of you in this room, except maybe Patrick, recognize them. And you can't see this little Colonel, the movie, which came out 2 years after Mickey Mouse, in 1935. You can't see this without seeing the affection between those two people. Right? Now there's a difference in age and so forth, but Bojangles and Shirley Temple had that affection for each other that came across on stage. Again, setting that example of an interracial couple. Granted, the grandfatherly and the young girl, you know, you don't get the love relationship necessarily, the couple relationship, but you certainly get a bonding or a caring there. So we have all kinds of genres. Cartoons, classic cartoons. This is another scene that doesn't exist. Here we have Simon Legree and the Bloodhounds with Uncle Tom hiding in the swamp. Never happened. Okay? Excuse me. This came out in 1943 and stayed on the cover for 16 printings. And then they changed the cover. And the last printing of classic comics was in 1970. 1987, movie with Avery Brooks as Uncle Tom, Felicia Rashad, you know her from the Cosby Family, as Eliza. I have a really hard time with this one. This is 2010. It's satire. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin Retreat. And you'll recognize many of our very influential black statesmen, politicians, entertainers, and in sports, right? And then behind you get Topsy and the minstrel show. I find it in bad taste. I don't know whether that's because it's so close to us in time or what, but I find it in bad taste. And then 2010, the audiobook. And notice how you would think this was an old cover of Uncle Tom's Cabin, except the red boy down here. So if you can't really bring yourself to read the book, check it out of the library. It's there, 2010. So what made Uncle Tom's Cabin work? What made it so famous? For one reason, Harriet Beecher Stowe was able to catch and capture domestic scenes. So for a long time on the covers you see Tom and his family, you know, hitting us over the head with, blacks are people too. You know, they have families, they love their families, they have children, they love their children. And this comes across over and over again. But she is able to capture domestic scenes where, when you think about the other two books that were published within a year of Uncle Tom's Cabin, there are no domestic scenes. One is The Scarlet Letter in 1850. Nothing domestic there except when you see Hester alone with Pearl, very strange things happen. And Moby Dick, which was published in 1851. There aren't even any women in Moby Dick. It has one kid, so how can there be domestic scenes? So she was able to capture these domestic scenes and intersperse them with the sensational scenes that we all remember. But you know, this has lasted for years and years and years. This idea of Tom with his children, with a family, and home. And here's Tom with one of his own kids. Later on, this will be replaced with Tom and little Eva, but you certainly get hit over the head that this is one of his own kids. And then we have the sensational scenes. This is from the first edition, and it is Eliza coming to tell Tom that the two of them have been sold. George Shelby, who is their kind master, runs into some financial trouble. Who doesn't, right? And you have to sell your slaves. So Eliza goes north to Canada, which gives Harriet one of her plot lines, and Tom gets sold down the river, which gives her the other plot line. And the further you go down the river, the worse life becomes for you. So there she is. And if you grew up with the Little Rascals on TV, they did in Uncle Tom's Cabin. They had white painted boxes for the ice floes, and they're doing this across the stage. They're all roped together. It's a wonderful scene, and it was very powerful on stage, as it is in the book. This is an advertisement for a stage performance from a lithograph of 1881, and these do not look like your everyday bloodhounds, do they? They were on stage. And there's Eliza running across the river. The friendly, helpful, saintly Quakers on one side, and the slave trader, he's not a slave catcher, he's a slave trader over here, with two black people behind him. And this is fairly significant because these are the two people who slowed down the slave trader enough so that Eliza could get away. They are portrayed as foolish. They're portrayed as the happy darky, kind of looking pretty stupid and foolish, but in essence, smart enough to fool the slave trader so that Eliza could get away. This is the first of Tom's being sold, and I love this lithograph. Tom's there, suit and tie. What could be more civilized than suit and tie, right? With a child in his lap. His wife is packing his box to go, and here is Mrs. Shelby. Mrs. Shelby looks comfortable in that cabin. She looks at home. She is the one who is most distressed. She's weeping there. The family is breaking up, and she, of many of the people in the book, considered the slaves her family. She is devastated by the sale of Tom and Eliza. Tom was the trusted slave. You could send him on errands. He'd always come back. He never tried to stir up the slaves and get them to revolt or anything like that. He is the perfect slave, hence the pejorative of Uncle Tom later on. But I think this is very telling. The next time Tom gets sold, it's not so pleasant. Here we have the slave auction, and Tom is being treated like a thing, the man that was a thing. He's being felt up to see how strong he is. Can he work in the fields? Tom was not a field, slave, and for him this is going to be a major, major change. Stowe does a magnificent job with this scene in the book. This is a very light-skinned slave being separated from her mother over here. Whoops. Being separated from her mother here. Stowe had lost a child through death. She knew she could play on the heartstrings of her audience if she showed this separation. And she writes this scene to the hilt. I mean, you're in tears by the time you finish reading this. And it was cruel. I mean, you knew what was going to happen to this light-skinned slave. She was going to be somebody's sexual partner. Things were not going to be easy for her. Luckily, Tom gets sold to Mr. Sinclair, who turns out to be a non-religious. He has questions about Christianity, but he's a very kind man, who has a daughter, little Eva, who falls off the steamboat into the water. Tom, luckily enough, is not shackled at this moment, jumps in to save her, thus endearing him to her father, obviously. And don't you love the perspective in this? You know, you could just reach over and pull somebody out of the water. I love it. Do you think this Tom could have rescued Eva? Or this one? Or this one? I think get older as they go along. But maybe this one. This is a young Tom on a cartoon, comic strip kind of thing. And he is saying, Eva is saying, Uncle Tom, would you like to be back in Kentucky with your family? What a stupid thing to ask. But it gives him the opportunity to say, yes, of course I would, little Eva, but I can't. And hence begins this relationship between the two of them. She's reading the Bible to Tom. He has his favorite passages marked. She reads them. And of course, pointing to heaven is not only pointing to God, but telling him that she will be leaving him soon. This is an 1853 illustration, very romanticized with the weeping trees in the background. It's almost those morning pictures that we see that were so popular. But Eva has another relationship, and that's with Topsy. They are as opposite as they can be. Eva is as pale can be. Talk about goody two-shoes. I mean, the kid can do nothing wrong. She's religious. She loves everybody. And then there's Topsy, as black as you can get, as incorrigible as you can get. Here portrayed rather sympathetically. Topsy's done something wrong. Eva is consoling her here, but that isn't always the case. Look at this cover. Wow. This is 1900. Now, if you gave your child a young folks edition, and your child lived in Westerly, Rhode Island in 1900 and had never seen a black person, which is entirely conceivable, what is that child going to think? You're speechless when you see something like that. Sometimes Topsy, now look at Topsy's face there. Doesn't she look about 50 years old? You know, she's done something wrong. Eva's consoling her, telling her it's not too late. And here is Aunt Ophelia, the New England aunt who has been called in to take care of the family and to civilize Topsy. And I love Aunt Ophelia because she has the grace to say, that as a Christian, she loves Topsy, but she can't bear to have her touch her. I think that's kind of honest. Don't you? I really do. I have a feeling he doesn't always come off as a kindly aunt. That's a terrible picture. Isn't that funny?
Ellen, would you go back one? There
Yes.
seemed to be a caption.
Yeah, what's that caption?
Now, what in the world makes you let me think you took the ribbon, Topsy? I think. Can you read it better from your angle?
That's okay. Took the necklace.
Took the necklace? So she's stolen something and is in big trouble. In the next one, she's stolen a ribbon, I think. And look how wistful she looks in this. You know, she's flirting almost with the audience in this one. Ah, I have the ribbon and you don't know that it's missing or whatever, or maybe a necklace. Look at how the same scene is portrayed here.
Not sympathetic at all.
Isn't that unbelievable? Look at the humpback, the muscles in her shoulders and arms. You know, it's not even blackface, it's worse. It's a grotesque caricature of Topsy. It's unbelievable. And here's Topsy as the song and dance. Everything's wonderful on the plantation girl. We get the introductions of the banjos and the guitars and the things that never show up in the book at all. But it does introduce that concept. And I rather like this one because I think the sunflower is like a banjo. You know, it's sending you that subliminal message of the banjo. And Topsy's not too bad in that one. And coloring is nice. But it's it's another version of Topsy. I have nothing to say about this next one. Those are the Duncan sisters again. But of course, Eva has to die. And Topsy is genuinely moved by his death because Eva's the only one who loves her. And Sinclair, the father, tends to understand and be sympathetic to Topsy here, lets her come into the room. And if those of you that are in the middle of the book, wait till you get to the section where Eva dies. It takes pages and pages and pages and pages, and it's a real tearjerker when she does die. The movies could do this very well because they could focus in on the flowers around her and the peacefulness and everything else when she died and ascended into heaven. And ascend she does. This is 1899 lithograph. I wanted to see if that was westerly granite, but couldn't really tell. It says Rock of Ages at the bottom, but I don't know. But it was scenes like this that said, innocent children and persecuted blacks because Uncle Tom dies. I hope I didn't spoil the book. Uncle Tom dies and they go to heaven. So Eva, the saint, contrasted with Simon Legree. I mean, isn't this wonderful? I mean, Snidely with Blanche, the whole dude, it's right there, Simon Legree. The evil, the third owner of Tom, who is pure evil. And he likes to whip his slaves. So, of course, this gives you another opportunity for some really graphic descriptions and pictures of whipping, if you're into that sort of thing. You can really find a lot of these. Sometimes Tom is shackled, sometimes he's in the cotton fields. And always because he does something good, like he picks enough cotton to fill up somebody else's basket who might not have picked enough. He is the generous, the good person, and of course, Simon Legree cannot stand that about him. And at the end, Simon Legree has two of his black slaves whip Uncle Tom to death. Here's one of the other slaves, Cassie, tendering to Tom's needs, but it's too late. Guess where Tom goes?
Yeah.
He goes to heaven. And so this is a book cover of Tom and probably, well, I don't know who the other person is at the bottom. But you can bet your bottom dollar Christ is there to welcome him into heaven, thus reassuring everyone that there's a place, of course, if you are a good person. And this is one of my favorites, not because of the artwork, because it's horrible as far as I'm concerned, but because it's not Christ who's welcoming him, it is little Eva, which is very appropriate. So, that is the end of what I hope didn't talk about the book, and I'm sorry if you came to talk about the book, but this is the impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin had on the culture and the history of it. And we are still influenced by this today, obviously, because you raised your hands when I said, do you know Uncle Tom, do you know Topsy, do you know Simon Legree, and you did. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an amazing thing for a book that's 150 years old to still have that power, and still have the power to raise the argument about Uncle Tom. Is he the subservient black who rolls over and does everything that the whites ask him to do? Martin Luther King. Or is he the brave man? Well, I guess I mixed that metaphor up, I'm sorry. Or is he the strong Christian man who lives by his principles and is willing to die for them?
It's my thumb, sorry.
So, any of you who want to leave now can leave, and the rest of you can ask some questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I must have missed it. What was the year that she started it?
Came out in hardcover before the newspaper had finished running the serial, the installments. So, you know, who knows? You got it? Okay, thanks. Yeah. Yes, Fritz.
What do you think made it so popular? Her talent as a writer or the message? I mean, why was it, how many, 300,000 books in a couple of years?
Well, first of all, it came at the opportune time. I mean, she took advantage of a groundswell of anti-slavery feelings. But I think also that because she was able to combine so many different aspects and still get that anti-slavery message across, that helped. There were a lot of anti-slavery novels that were out. This one distinguished itself. You would have to say that that was because of her family name and because of her talent in writing, I think. So I can't tell you percentages, but both.
What can you tell us about the reaction south?
Oh, well, not good.
Oh, no.
Not good. Yeah. Immediately after Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, there were more than 50 books published on how wonderful slavery was, anti-Uncle Tom books. And they picked up some of the same characters. They told the story from a different perspective. The whole book was persona non grata. She was persona non grata, and the book was not appreciated in the South at all. Southerners felt that it didn't tell the right story. Nobody could be as evil as Simon Legree.
Are you aware of any writer that has tried to interpret this book, present-day events in mind? Because there's so much of it that is apropos to present-day things. Like we can be cerebral about the wrongs of life, and like the senator that voted for the Fugitive Slave Act. And of course he changed once he saw Eliza all bruised and battered and so forth. And it's so apropos to how we are that so long as the things are in sight, we don't care about them that much.
I don't know of any really critical research that's been done that applies it today. That doesn't mean that it's not there, okay? Henry Gates annotated version makes a few comparisons to today, or he leads you down that path. Most of the stuff being written about Uncle Tom's Cabin today is the kind of stuff I showed you, the impact that it had on the culture seems to be where we are with criticism today. So I don't know of any, but again, that doesn't mean that it's not there.
Well, like I said before, I first read the book yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I finished
It's
it.
amazing. And he's a
I finished it
Southerner.
about 8 o'clock last night, and it's all fresh in my mind, and I see so much what goes on now that is in the book.
And maybe that speaks to Fritz's question. Maybe what she's done is capture the Eternals in a story form that can transcend the ages. Certainly this book was so popular around the world where there was no slavery that there had to have been something that people were identifying with. I would not like to think we all knew Simon Legrie's, you know, who were that evil, or in fact people who were that good, as she portrays them. Yeah?
I read in Wikipedia.
True admission,
The
good.
second, in that century, the sale of Uncle Tom's Cabin was second in the century, second only to the Bible.
It's amazing.
Amazing popular.
The interesting thing is that I'm now reading Silent Spring for my book
Oh,
group.
wow.
And the introduction is written by, of the version I have is written by Al Gore, who's a Southerner, when he was vice president, so you can tell it's an old copy. And he says that Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most influential book in America in the 19th century because of the impact it had on society. And then, of course, he says Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, is the most influential book of the 20th century in terms of its impact. And I thought, oh my, I've read those two books in the same month. That's wonderful. But it's interesting. He says that Uncle Tom's Cabin was written at a time when people were aware of the problem, and all she had to do was fictionalize it and present it, whereas Silent Spring was written about a problem that people didn't know existed. So he gives more credit to Rachel Carson than he does to Harriet Beecher Stowe. I give a lot of credit to her. Yes?
Are there any quotes? What was W.E.B. Du Bois's attitude toward Uncle Tom's Cabin?
I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I have to confess,
Yeah.
you know, I did this dissertation, which was not on this topic at all. It was a textual edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin, back in 1980. So it's been 36, 35 years. I don't know what his reaction was. It would be easy to find.
How?
Just Google it.
Agree.
No, say both things.
Yeah, say Dubois and Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Tom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and somebody will have written about it. Or you can call me in a week, Helen, and I will research it in my vast library of Uncle Tom's. Because I will have it somewhere in my library. Yeah. Anything else?
Ellen, what was the content of your dissertation? What was the focus?
It's called a textual edition, which is done when a writer writes in longhand usually, manuscript. So Melville, Cooper, Stowe, all these people require textual editions where Mark Twain and people who typed their manuscripts didn't need to do this. And what you do is you find a dear friend to read it with you, and you read every single word and every single piece of punctuation
What's your
between the
goal?
first edition and the manuscript or whatever you're working with. So we did National Era, 8 manuscript pages, and the first edition. Your goal is to establish an edition which scholars can use and use that as the authoritative division. So it's a mystery. You try to figure out what was the author's intent, and not when a person couldn't read her handwriting and set the type wrong, or when a kid dropped the tray of type and tried to reset it from memory. And I found very few what are called substantive changes that would really affect it. with Melville, with Moby Dick, for example, they found that it had been printed, a word had been printed, masked, and it was really mask. And it changed the whole meaning of that paragraph, of that chapter of the book.
Tied to the mask.
Yeah, and it was somebody that just couldn't read his handwriting.
Do you know how many known copies there are, first edition copies, and what they'd be worth?
Hundreds,
So there's-
thousands. Yeah, what happened was that Jewett didn't, he was in such a hurry that when he went to his second printing, he forgot to slug it as a second printing. So all those things that would have been looked at as second printings were first editions. Yeah, which drives collectors crazy. I had several first editions, and when I went to sell them and get rid of them, peanuts. You know, they aren't worth much. The manuscript leaves, though, are a different story. When Stowe became famous, somehow the manuscript leaves must have gotten back to the family. I don't know whether it was Dr. Bailey's habit to return manuscript leaves or whatever, but they had a whole lot of them. So when people would write to Stowe to ask her for her autograph, helpful Calvin just mailed them a manuscript page.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine? So if you look in your attics at home and you find a manuscript leaf, you may have one of Uncle Tom's Cabin. There were only, I think, 8 extant, and most of them are in Hartford or at the University in California.
8.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Were the first editions illustrated at all?
There were 6 illustrations. I think I showed you 2. Eliza going in to tell Tom that she and he had been sold, and maybe the one of Cassie helping Tom at the end. That I can't remember if that was National Era. National Era did illustrations as well, and the first edition.
Well, thank you, because I now understand, after scratching my head for the first half of the book, that Uncle Tom's Cabin title, why it wasn't about Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I don't think she knew where the book was going to go
Right.
when she started writing it. You know, she had these little vignettes and she just wove them together. Like many of our authors today do. Don?
Having lived for about 40 years in Kentucky myself, but being raised here in Wesley, I first became aware, we weren't taught about the Tom Cabin here in Wesley schools growing up.
No.
And I first became aware of it living in Maysville, Kentucky, and that's where supposedly Harriet Beecher Stowe got influenced, witnessing the slave auction right there in a town called Washington, Kentucky, which is now part of Maysville. And they make a big to-do about it today. So I grabbed Uncle Tom's Cabin and wrote it at that time. And it just was plain today to me about, you mentioned her intent. I think her intent was to enlighten those of us who weren't familiar with that type of life at all, and to teach us what was really happening, and to get people in America mad and do something about it. That's my observation.
She did. That's right.
And so in this little town of Washington, Kentucky, which was named Washington because they thought they were going to try to move the capital to a central part of America.
Oh, isn't that neat?
And the home where she visited and witnessed the slave auction right there in the town square is still there, and it's a museum today. So,
and you can find, if you travel in the South, you can find at least 5 Uncle Tom's Cabins. You can visit.
Yeah.
You can visit, and you can pay them money to guide you through, and there was no single person for basically any of these characters, even though many people jumped up. Josiah Henson was like, I'm Uncle Tom, I'm the one, you know. Well, he died in the book, you know, you want to tell us. I'm the person that she based Uncle Tom on. And then she was forced to write a book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin after this, in which she gave proof, essentially, of all of the incidents that she included. It's deadly boring. Don't read it. But, you know, so she tried to say, this was my research. This is, you know, these are my research notes that I'm publishing. So, but There was no single.
Did Harriet ever write anything else that reached that degree of prominence?
No. Now, my mother's favorite book is Pearl of Orr's Island, which takes place in Maine. She had a lot of religious tracts almost that she wrote, and most of her novels trended towards the religious aspect, the minister's wooing and all of these other books. Don't come near Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not at all.
She didn't have that inspiration.
She needed to go to church again, sit on there at Communion Sunday and get inspired again.
Was she ever in any danger from people who?
I don't know. She traveled through England. Queen Victoria met her. The British women raised a tremendous amount of money to help fight slavery in America. She was, I mean, you don't get invited to Queen Victoria's all the time for dinner or whatever, and she did. She was a huge worldwide hero. Whether there were threats on her life, I don't know much.
That unimpeachable source, Wikipedia, says that at the time there were a lot of threats that originated in the South.
From the South.
But you know, the war came, shortly after
Pretty
that.
soon, that's right.
Probably a lot of strong feeling.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. And I'm sure that many, many Southerners blamed her for inflaming the passions of the North.
They wrote quite a few rebuttals.
They wrote a
right?
lot
I
of
mean,
rebuttals,
how slaves are treated, much different than she portrayed. And,
yeah. And I don't know, I mean, I could find out, but I don't know to what kind of audience those, how far they reached in terms of making an impact.
Sold good in Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah, so?
You mentioned in, I think it was 1890, there were 500 companies in production.
Yeah.
Was that just in the United States?
Yes.
So it wasn't in the South at all?
You don't think so, but by 1890, I'm not sure. That one I would have to research even further. But when you say it like that, and you limit it to just the North and the West, by 1890, you couldn't go into any town without finding a performance. Yeah.
I don't know how the two are around because they'd be following each other.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why you had to outdo each other. You had to have the two Topsies and the two Simon Legrees and the two whipping scenes and the bigger dogs and the longer death scenes with little Eva. So, but I don't know how far into the South they reached at that point. That would have been 30 years after it would have been Reconstruction, would have happened. I don't know.
I spent a lot of time in the South too, and still not very well studied.
Well, then we'll just say that we're in the North. Anything else?